The Eastern Front of World War II was a maelstrom of fire and blood, a brutal struggle between ideologies and empires. From the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, German and Soviet forces clashed in a conflict of unimaginable ferocity. Yet even amidst this crucible of war, one battle emerged as a terrifying epic unto itself, the Battle of Stalingrad. This wasn't just a battle for territory, it was a fight for survival, a clash of wills that would forever scar the landscape and the souls of those who endured it. Stalingrad, a bustling industrial city on the banks of the Volga River, became a symbol of both Soviet resilience and the utter devastation of war. For months, from August 1942 to February 1943, the city transformed into a nightmarish landscape of rubble and ruin. Buildings became fortresses, streets turned into deadly killing zones, and the very air crackled with the sounds of gunfire, explosions, and the anguished cries of the wounded. The Battle of Stalingrad was more than just a military engagement. It was a human tragedy of epic proportions. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers on both sides perished in the fighting, along with countless civilians caught in the crossfire. The stories of their courage, suffering and sacrifice would echo through history, a stark reminder of the true cost of war. For Adolf Hitler, Stalingrad held immense strategic importance. The city bore the name of his nemesis, Joseph Stalin, and its capture would be a symbolic victory, a blow to Soviet morale. More tangibly, control of Stalingrad meant control of the Volga River, a vital artery for Soviet oil shipments. Hitler believed that by seizing Stalingrad, he could cripple the Soviet war effort and secure his grip on the oil-rich Caucasus region. On the Soviet side, the defense of Stalingrad became a matter of national pride and survival. Stalin himself issued a no-retreat order, famously known as "not one step back." The city's defenders, a mix of regular army units, militia and even factory workers, fought with unparalleled tenacity, determined to hold the city at any cost. The stage was set for a titanic struggle, a clash between two ruthless dictatorships, each willing to expend vast resources and manpower to achieve their goals. The fate of the Eastern Front, and perhaps the entire war, hung in the balance. As the German war machine rumbled towards Stalingrad, the world watched, holding its breath, bracing for the inevitable storm. The summer of 1942 saw the German army, the Wehrmacht, at the peak of its power. Fresh from victories in Ukraine and the Crimea, the Wehrmacht turned its sights north towards Stalingrad. Leading the charge was the German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, a meticulous planner known for his attention to detail. Paulus had at his disposal a formidable force, including crack panzer divisions, seasoned infantry and the dreaded Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, providing close air support. The German offensive, codenamed Operation Blue, commenced in late June 1942. The initial advance was swift and brutal. The Luftwaffe unleashed a relentless aerial bombardment, reducing entire city blocks to rubble and sowing terror among the civilian population. Panzer columns, spearheaded by the fearsome Tiger tanks, punched through Soviet lines, exploiting gaps and ruthlessly exploiting any weakness. The speed and ferocity of the German advance caught the Soviets off guard. Their defences, hastily prepared and often outmatched, crumbled under the weight of the onslaught. Soviet soldiers, many of them conscripts with little training, fought bravely, but were often forced to retreat in the face of overwhelming firepower. The road to Stalingrad lay open, and the Wehrmacht, confident of victory, surged forward. As the German army approached Stalingrad in August 1942, the city underwent a chilling metamorphosis. The bustling industrial hub, once home to over 600,000 people, transformed into a fortress city. Factories, still churning out tanks and weapons, became battlegrounds. Every building, every street corner was fortified in anticipation of the coming storm. The civilian population, caught in the grip of war, faced a stark choice: flee across the Volga River or stay and endure the coming siege. Thousands chose to evacuate, braving Luftwaffe attacks and the chaos of a city under bombardment. Many, however, remained either unable or unwilling to abandon their homes. Their lives would be forever intertwined with the fate of Stalingrad. The city itself became a character in the unfolding drama. The Volga River, wide and unforgiving, formed a natural barrier to the east, but also a potential escape route for the defenders. The city's sprawling industrial complexes, with their maze-like factories and towering smokestacks, provided ideal terrain for urban warfare. The battle for Stalingrad would be fought street by street, building by building, a brutal test of endurance and resolve. Section 3. Holding the line, early Soviet resistance. Despite the ferocity of the German onslaught, the Soviets were determined to hold Stalingrad. They understood the city's symbolic importance and its strategic value as a vital transportation hub on the Volga. The defense of Stalingrad was entrusted to the 62nd Army, commanded by General Vasily Chuikov, a hardened veteran known for his tenacity and his ability to inspire his troops. Chuikov's orders were simple and brutal: hold Stalingrad at all costs. He understood that the urban environment, with its rubble-strewn streets and shattered buildings, could be turned to the defenders' advantage. Chuikov implemented a strategy of close combat, forcing the Germans to fight for every inch of ground. Snipers, operating from concealed positions, inflicted heavy casualties on the advancing enemy. The Soviets also employed a tactic known as hugging the enemy. By staying close to the German lines, they negated the Luftwaffe's advantage in air power, as close air support risked friendly fire. This tactic, while risky, forced the Germans into a grinding war of attrition, sapping their morale and slowing their advance. The defenders of Stalingrad, though outnumbered and outgunned, had drawn a line in the sand. They were prepared to fight and die for every inch of their city. Section 1. A city aflame. The struggle for every street. The battle for Stalingrad descended into a nightmarish realm of urban warfare, defying the very principles of traditional combat. Gone were the sweeping maneuvers and open battlefields. Instead, the fight raged amidst the rubble of a shattered city. Streets became corridors of death, buildings transformed into fortresses, and basements served as makeshift shelters from the relentless bombardment. The Germans, accustomed to swift victories and mobile warfare, found themselves bogged down in a brutal struggle for every street, every house. Tanks, once symbols of German military might, became sitting ducks in the narrow streets, vulnerable to anti-tank guns and Molotov cocktails hurled from rooftops. The Luftwaffe, unable to effectively distinguish between friend and foe in the urban labyrinth, rained down bombs indiscriminately, adding to the carnage and turning Stalingrad into a desolate landscape of smoke, fire and rubble. The Soviets, though outgunned and outnumbered, held a distinct advantage in this environment. They knew every alleyway, every building, every sewer tunnel. They employed snipers to deadly effect, picking off German officers and machine gun nests. Small mobile units armed with submachine guns and grenades launched surprise attacks on enemy positions, disappearing back into the labyrinthine ruins before the Germans could react. The fighting raged day and night, a chaotic and terrifying symphony of gunfire, explosions, and the screams of the wounded. The Volga River, the city's lifeline, turned red with blood as both sides fought desperately for control of the waterfront, exposing themselves to enemy fire in a desperate bid to unload supplies and evacuate casualties. The city itself seemed to be bleeding, its streets and buildings scarred by the ceaseless violence. Section 2. Red. October. A factory complex becomes a fortress. Amidst the urban wasteland, certain landmarks emerged as focal points of the struggle for Stalingrad. One such location was the Red October Steel Factory, a sprawling industrial complex that became a microcosm of the entire battle. The factory, still partially operational, churned out weapons and ammunition by day, while by night its workers, many of them women, joined the soldiers in defending their workplace-turned-battleground. The Germans, recognizing the factory's strategic importance, threw wave after wave of attacks against its defenses, Tanks rumbled through the factory gates, their guns blasting at workshops and administrative buildings. Infantry squads, their faces grim with determination, stormed through the factory grounds, engaging in fierce hand-to-hand combat with the Soviet defenders. The Soviets, however, refused to yield. They transformed the factory's buildings into interconnected fortresses, using tunnels and communication trenches to move men and supplies. They turned wrecked machinery into defensive positions, pouring fire on the advancing Germans from behind, twisted metal and piles of scrap. Snipers, perched atop smokestacks and water towers, picked off German officers and artillery observers, their deadly accuracy sowing fear and disrupting enemy attacks. The battle for Red October raged for weeks, a brutal and unforgiving struggle for every inch of ground. The factory, once a symbol of Soviet industrial might, now stood as a testament to the tenacity and fighting spirit of its defenders, a place where ordinary men and women performed extraordinary acts of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. In the southern part of Stalingrad, another battle, seemingly insignificant in the grand scheme of the conflict, would come to symbolize the indomitable spirit of the Soviet defenders. This was the fight for a seemingly ordinary four-story apartment building, later dubbed Pavlov's house, after the sergeant who led its defense. The building, strategically located near a key crossroads, offered a commanding view of the surrounding area. Recognizing its tactical value, Sergeant Yakov Pavlov, leading a platoon of men, seized the building from a small German garrison and transformed it into a formidable fortress. Working tirelessly under constant enemy fire, Pavlov and his men fortified the building's defenses. They created multiple firing positions, laid down barbed wire entanglements, and mined the approaches. They even managed to establish communication with the Soviet lines using a telephone line strung across the street, allowing them to call in artillery support. For over 2 months, Pavlov and his men held their ground against repeated German assaults. They repelled tank attacks, fought off infantry charges, and endured constant shelling and sniper fire. Their resilience, their refusal to yield even when faced with overwhelming odds, turned Pavlov's house into a symbol of Soviet resistance, a beacon of defiance in the heart of the German advance. By late autumn of 1942, the Battle of Stalingrad had reached a bloody stalemate. The Germans, exhausted and depleted by months of relentless urban warfare, clung precariously to their gains. They controlled most of the city, but their advance had been halted at the banks of the Volga. The Soviets, battered but unbroken, clung fiercely to their remaining pockets of resistance, inflicting heavy casualties and disrupting any hope of a decisive German victory. The relentless fighting had taken a heavy toll on both sides. The streets of Stalingrad were littered with the bodies of the dead, both German and Soviet, a grim testament to the ferocity of the fighting. The air, thick with the stench of cordite and decaying flesh, carried the constant drone of aircraft engines and the thunderous roar of artillery. Yet, unknown to the weary combatants, a dramatic shift in the strategic landscape was about to unfold. While the Germans focused their attention on capturing the last remaining Soviet strongholds within Stalingrad, the Soviet High Command, under the direction of Generals Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, had been secretly amassing a massive counteroffensive force. This force, consisting of fresh troops, tanks and artillery, was poised to strike not at Stalingrad itself, but at the vulnerable flanks of the German army, held by overstretched and poorly equipped Romanian and Italian units. The Soviets knew that their window of opportunity was limited. Winter was fast approaching, bringing with it the threat of freezing temperatures and treacherous conditions. The Germans, already suffering from supply shortages and low morale, would be even more vulnerable once the full fury of the Russian winter descended upon them. The stage was set for a dramatic reversal of fortunes, a counterstroke that would have far-reaching consequences for the course of the war. On the cold and misty morning of November 19, 1942, Operation Uranus, the Soviet counteroffensive, erupted with stunning ferocity. Exploiting intelligence gathered from intercepted German communications and aerial reconnaissance, the Soviets launched a two-pronged attack, targeting the weak points in the German lines north and south of Stalingrad. The initial assault caught the Romanian troops, ill-equipped for winter warfare, and lacking the will to fight for a city that held no symbolic value for them, completely by surprise. The Red Army, spearheaded by T-34 tanks, surged forward, their tracks churning the frozen ground, their guns blazing. The Romanian defences, outgunned and outnumbered, crumbled under the weight of the onslaught. Simultaneously in the south, Soviet forces under the command of General Andrei Yeremenko launched a similar attack, shattering the Italian Eighth Army and driving deep into the German rear. The German Sixth Army, deeply engaged in the brutal street fighting within Stalingrad, was caught completely off guard. Their flanks, which they had assumed were secure, had been ripped open, and now a massive Soviet force threatened to encircle them entirely. The speed and ferocity of the Soviet offensive stunned the German high command. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, known for his tactical brilliance, was hastily dispatched to assess the situation and stabilize the front. However, even Manstein, faced with the sheer scale and determination of the Soviet counterattack, could do little to stem the tide. The initiative, which for months had rested firmly in German hands, had shifted dramatically. Section 3. The Iron Fist closes, trapping the German Sixth Army. As the Soviet pincers closed around Stalingrad, panic gripped the German high command. What had been a seemingly inevitable victory had transformed into a desperate struggle for survival. Hitler, initially dismissive of the Soviet counteroffensive, refused to allow Paulus to break out of the encirclement, believing that the Sixth Army could hold out and be resupplied by air. This proved to be a fatal miscalculation. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin by the demands of the Eastern Front, was unable to deliver the necessary supplies to the besieged Sixth Army. The winter weather, with its sub-zero temperatures and heavy snowfall, further hampered the Luftwaffe's efforts, grounding transport aircraft and exposing the trapped German soldiers to the full fury of the Russian winter. By late November, the encirclement was complete. The once mighty Sixth Army, now trapped within a shrinking pocket of territory around Stalingrad, faced a stark choice: surrender or face annihilation. Inside the pocket, conditions were desperate. Food, ammunition and medical supplies ran dangerously low. The wounded, lacking adequate care, succumbed to their injuries or froze to death in the bitter cold. The streets of Stalingrad, already a wasteland of rubble and ruin, became a frozen charnel house. The living envied the dead, for at least they were spared the suffering. The stage was set for the final act of the Battle of Stalingrad, a tragic and bloody denouement that would forever be etched in the annals of military history. Section 1. A City of Bones, Life and Death in the Kessel. The German Sixth Army, once a symbol of Nazi military might, was now trapped in what the Germans called the cauldron. Surrounded by the Red Army, they were cut off from all but the most meagre supplies. The Luftwaffe's attempts to airlift provisions proved woefully inadequate, with many transport planes falling victim to Soviet anti-aircraft fire or simply unable to land in the increasingly treacherous weather conditions. Within the once proud German soldiers were reduced to shadows of their former selves. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, the bitter cold sapping their strength. Frostbite became a constant threat, turning fingers and toes black with gangrene. The wounded, lacking adequate medical care, succumbed to their injuries or froze to death in the icy ruins. The relentless shelling and sniper fire from the Red Army added to their misery. There was no escape, no respite. Every day brought fresh horrors, pushing the German soldiers to the very limits of human endurance. Despair settled over them like a suffocating shroud. Letters scribbled home spoke of unimaginable suffering, of a growing sense of hopelessness. Yet, even amidst the death and despair, flickers of humanity remained. Acts of compassion, however small, provided a glimmer of light in the encroaching darkness. Soldiers shared their meagre rations with the wounded. Medics, working tirelessly with dwindling supplies, fought to save lives. And always there was the faint hope, however improbable, of rescue, of escaping the frozen hell that Stalingrad had become. Section 2, Operation Winter Storm, a futile attempt at relief. As the situation within grew increasingly desperate, the German High Command, spurred by a sense of urgency and loyalty to their encircled comrades, launched a desperate counteroffensive. Operation Winter Storm, commanded by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, aimed to break through the Soviet encirclement and relieve the trapped Sixth Army. The offensive, launched in mid-December 1942, initially met with some success. Manstein, a brilliant strategist, exploited gaps in the Soviet lines, using a combination of panzer divisions and mobile infantry to punch a corridor towards Stalingrad. Hope, however fleeting, flickered within thee as the sound of distant gunfire reached the ears of the trapped soldiers. However, the Soviet defences, though stretched thin, proved more resilient than anticipated. The Red Army, bolstered by fresh reserves and determined to prevent the relief of the Sixth Army, launched a series of ferocious counterattacks, slowing the German advance and inflicting heavy casualties. The German offensive, already hampered by logistical difficulties and the harsh winter conditions, began to falter. Fuel shortages grounded tanks, while ammunition and supplies dwindled to critical levels. Manstein, recognizing the futility of his position, pleaded with Hitler to allow Paulus to break out of Stalingrad and link up with his forces. Hitler, however, remained steadfast in his refusal, convinced that the Sixth Army could still hold out. Section 3. The Agony of Surrender, the Fall of the Sixth Army. With the failure of Operation Winter Storm, the fate of the German Sixth Army was sealed. Trapped, starving and decimated by relentless Soviet attacks, their situation became hopeless. The Red Army, sensing victory, tightened its grip on their artillery, pounding the German positions with merciless precision. On January 8, 1943, the Soviet High Command offered General Paulus an honourable surrender. They promised medical care for the wounded, adequate food and shelter, and repatriation after the war. Paulus, a loyal soldier bound by Hitler's orders, requested permission to surrender, but was met with a resounding refusal. Hitler, in a delusional rant, declared that the Sixth Army should fight to the last man, becoming martyrs for the fatherland. Paulus, faced with the annihilation of his army, finally disobeyed Hitler's orders. On January 31, 1943, he surrendered the southern pocket of along with his remaining staff. A few days later, on February 2, 1943, the northern pocket of German resistance collapsed, marking the end of the Battle of Stalingrad. The surrender of the Sixth Army, one of Germany's most formidable military formations, sent shockwaves through the Third Reich. The news, suppressed for days by the Nazi propaganda machine, shattered the myth of German invincibility. The world watched in astonishment as images of tens of thousands of haggard, frostbitten German soldiers, once symbols of Nazi might, were marched into captivity. The Battle of Stalingrad, fought with unparalleled ferocity and brutality, had reached its tragic conclusion. The victory, however costly, belonged to the Soviets. The tide of war had turned. Section 1. Victory's Shadow, the Cost of Stalingrad. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad came at an unimaginable cost. The city itself lay in ruins, a desolate wasteland of rubble and bones. The streets, once bustling with life, were eerily silent, save for the mournful cry of the wind whistling through shattered windows. The stench of death lingered in the air, a grim reminder of the carnage that had unfolded. The human toll was staggering. Estimates vary, but it is believed that over 1 million soldiers and civilians perished during the battle, making it one of the deadliest confrontations in human history. The Red Army, though ultimately victorious, suffered horrific casualties, with over 400,000 soldiers killed and over 600,000 wounded. The German Sixth Army, trapped and decimated, suffered close to 200,000 casualties, with over 90,000 taken prisoner. The survivors, both German and Soviet, bore the physical and psychological scars of the battle. Many were haunted by nightmares, plagued by memories of the horrors they had witnessed. The trauma of Stalingrad, etched into their very souls, would stay with them long after the guns fell silent. The city itself, once a thriving industrial centre, took decades to rebuild. The physical scars of the battle were slow to heal, a constant reminder of the terrible price of conflict. Yet even amidst the ruins, a spirit of resilience endured, a determination to rebuild and honour the memory of those who had fought and died for their city. Section 2. Turning point on the Volga Stalingrad's legacy. The Battle of Stalingrad marked a turning point in World War II, a pivotal moment that shifted the strategic balance in favour of the Allies. The German defeat shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility, exposing the limitations of their resources and the fallibility of their leadership. The Red Army, bloodied but unbowed, had proved its mettle, demonstrating a tenacity and fighting spirit that would ultimately carry them to Berlin. The victory at Stalingrad had a profound psychological impact on both sides of the conflict. For the Soviet people, who had endured unimaginable suffering under Nazi occupation, Stalingrad became a symbol of their resilience, their determination to defend their homeland at any cost. The victory boosted morale, both on the home front and on the battlefield, galvanizing the Soviet war effort and inspiring resistance movements across occupied Europe. For Germany, Stalingrad was a crushing blow, both militarily and psychologically. The loss of the Sixth Army, a devastating blow to German manpower and prestige, exposed the folly of Hitler's strategic ambitions. The defeat also marked the beginning of Germany's retreat from the east, as the Red Army, emboldened by their victory at Stalingrad, launched a series of offensives that would eventually drive the Wehrmacht back to Berlin. The Battle of Stalingrad, a brutal and costly struggle fought in the rubble of a shattered city, stands as a testament to the human capacity for both unimaginable cruelty and extraordinary courage. It is a stark reminder of the horrors of war and the enduring legacy of those who fight and die in the name of freedom and their homeland. The memory of Stalingrad, etched in stone and blood, serves as a warning to future generations. A reminder that the true cost of conflict is measured not just in territory gained or lost, but in the countless lives forever shattered by the scourge of war.